The boy hadn't spoken a single word in 2 years, not even a whisper. But when he found the half-dead German shepherd in the forest, eyes full of pain, body riddled with scars, something inside him awakened. He reached out and the dog looked back, not with fear, but with faith. What happened next? A miracle, a bond so deep it defied science and justice alike. Stay with us to witness a story that might just change the way you see silence and the power of second chances. The wind whispered cold warnings through the pines of Willow Creek, a small mountain town tucked deep in the snowy ridges of Montana. Late October had wrapped the town in a quilt of frost and wood smoke, and though snow had yet to fall, the air carried the kind of bite that promised winter's breath was near. The sky was pewter gray, the clouds low and heavy, brushing the tops of the evergreens like smoke drifting from some ancient fire. The roads were mostly quiet now, the harvest season having passed and the tourists having long gone. Only the locals remained moving with a kind of slowness that matched the fading light. At the edge of this sleepy town stood a cedar-shingled cabin with a rusted roof and a front porch that creaked with age. This was where Eli Whitman, a 6-year-old boy with a heart full of shadows and silence, lived with his grandfather. Eli was small, thin, with pale skin, and tangled blonde hair that often stuck up in tufts, no matter how much Walter, his grandfather, tried to tame it. His eyes were a haunting shade of storm gray, large and unblinking, as if always waiting for something to happen, something just beyond the edge of understanding. He hadn't spoken in over a year. The fire had stolen his voice. It had taken his father first, James Whitman, a volunteer firefighter and local hero who'd run back into a burning house to save a child. The child survived. James didn't. His mother, Clara, had tried to stay strong for Eli, but the grief consumed her slowly, like a house eaten from the inside by termites. One morning, she simply didn't wake up. The doctors called it heart failure. Walter called it heartbreak. Walter Whitman, a retired sheriff in his 70s with silver hair, and a voice like cracked leather, had stepped in as guardian when the state couldn't find any closer kin. He was tall, with a bit of a stoop from a life of chasing down bad men and doing right by a town that didn't always appreciate how quietly he kept it safe. He didn't talk much anymore either, not because he couldn't, but because grief in its own quiet way had taught him when words failed, presence could still mean something. Eli didn't go to school, at least not the traditional kind. He had a tutor twice a week and therapy sessions every other Friday, though he rarely responded. What he did do day in and day out was draw. Always the same thing. A German shepherd, noble and scarred, standing watch in stormy places. In some sketches, the dog was howling into the wind. In others, it lay in a ditch, eyes wide and sad. No one could explain why that image had taken hold of the boy's imagination. Not even Eli. That morning, as Walter patched a loose gutter on the cabin's roof, Eli wandered toward the forest. The sky was darkening faster than expected, clouds blooming low and angry above the ridge. Walter didn't notice at first. He assumed Eli was playing near the creek, as he sometimes did, but Eli was drawn elsewhere, pulled perhaps by something he couldn't name. He stepped into the woods where the trees grew older and closer together, their branches forming a cathedral of moss and wind. Dry leaves crackled beneath his boots. The air was heavy with the smell of damp bark, and something else fainter but distinct, a scent he didn't recognize. Metallic, like old pennies and rust. As he moved deeper into the forest, the light faded. The only sounds were the whisper of wind and the crunch of his own footsteps. Then, suddenly, something else. A sound that didn't belong. A soft broken whimper barely there, but enough to make Eli freeze. He tilted his head and listened again. The sound came again from behind a thick clump of fallen branches near a narrow ridge. Eli climbed carefully, his small hands brushing moss from the stones. and then he saw it. A body, curled into the roots of an old pine, almost hidden by earth and debris. At first, he thought it was dead, a tangle of fur blood and brokenness. But then one ear twitched, a low warning growl rumbled out. Soft and strained. Eli didn't move. He crouched where he was. His breath held his heart suddenly beating faster. The creature opened one eye. It was a German shepherd, large, though thinned by injury and starvation. Its fur was filthy and tangled, smeared with dried blood and streaks of mud. One leg was twisted unnaturally beneath it. Around its neck, partly obscured by grime, was what looked like a collar military grade, faded and worn. The dog's breathing was shallow. It looked at Eli not with aggression, but with something that seemed much closer to despair. And still its eye locked with Eli's, amber against gray, pain against silence. The boy didn't speak, but he didn't run either. He simply sat just a few feet away and waited. Walter found the boy just as the last of the gray light dipped beneath the tree line. His breath caught when he spotted Eli crouched beside the tangled body of the dog. For a moment, he didn't move. Just watched, trying to understand the gravity of what he was seeing. Eli's small frame sat frozen in the quiet, his hand slowly reaching out, but not quite touching the battered German shepherd lying in the bed of earth and pine needles. The animal, large and ragged with a military collar still clinging to its neck, lifted its head weakly at Walter's presence, but didn't growl. Walter approached cautiously. His old joints protested every step, his boots crunching the brittle layer of frost-coated needles. "Eli," he said softly, not expecting a reply but needing to say something. Eli turned and met his grandfather's gaze. No fear, just quiet, resolve in those strange moonlit eyes. Walter knelt beside them. Up close, he could see the extent of the damage, the dried blood matting the dog's fur. The shallow breaths, the strange stillness of the hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The smell was unmistakable, old wounds, infection, and something else, metal like rusted iron in rain. His fingers brushed the collar, revealing a worn but still legible tag, engraved with a serial number, K9M17. A surge of something old and buried stirred in Walter's chest. He had worn a badge for over 30 years. He knew the look of a dog trained to serve, but this one had been left behind. "We can't leave him here," he muttered. Eli didn't respond. He didn't need to. Together, they fashioned a makeshift sling from Walter's flannel overshirt and a length of rope tied through Eli's belt loops. The dog, too weak to protest, let them lift him carefully, groaning low, but without aggression. Walter cradled most of the weight, his arms burning his back, crying out in protest, with every step back through the underbrush. Eli stayed close, one hand steady on the dog's side, as if afraid the moment they lost contact, the fragile thing between them might break. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky had turned a deep indigo, and the first flakes of snow had begun to fall, fine as flour and just as silent. Walter didn't bother to remove his boots as he crossed the porch and kicked the door open. He laid the dog down near the hearth, already crackling with fresh pine logs. "Stay with him," he said, grabbing the phone from the wall. His fingers still numb from the cold, punched in a familiar number. On the other end, a woman's voice picked up, brisk but warm. "Maeve's clinic." Maeve speaking. "Maeve, it's Walter Whitman. I need you to come out to the house. It's urgent. What's going on?" "We found a dog, a German shepherd. He's in bad shape, been shot, looks military, might be tagged." A pause. "Then I'm on my way." 15 minutes, Maeve Hollis was Willow Creek's only veterinarian. In her early 40s, with close-cropped red hair and a habit of muttering to herself when thinking she had a reputation for being no nonsense but deeply compassionate, Maeve had returned to her hometown after spending most of her career working in urban emergency clinics, burned out from the chaos and yearning for something slower, something meaningful. She was tall and lean, with long fingers that moved like they had their own memory. Her eyes were green, flecked with gold, always alert, always analyzing. She arrived in a dark blue SUV, splattered with mud from farm visits. When she stepped inside and saw the dog, her expression shifted instantly from curiosity to concern. She dropped to her knees beside the animal and began her examination with practiced care. "Multiple lacerations," she murmured. "Old scarring here. One fresh gunshot wound, possibly a .22. Infection's already setting in. He's severely malnourished." Her fingers found the metal tag on the collar. "K-9 unit," she muttered. "Military or police for sure, but what the hell is he doing out here?" Eli watched in silence from the corner of the room, his sketchbook now open on his lap pencil, dancing lightly across the paper. He wasn't drawing the dog this time. He was drawing. Maeve bent over the wounded creature, the firelight making her look like a saint in an old painting. Maeve looked up and caught his gaze. "You found him." Eli nodded once. Maeve's voice softened. "He's lucky you did." Outside, the snow continued to fall now, thicker, brushing against the windows like whispers. Walter poured a mug of coffee, his hands shaking, not from age, but from something deeper. "Maeve," he said, setting the mug down beside her, "can you patch him up here?" She glanced around the cabin. "I've got enough supplies in the truck to stabilize him, but if he makes it through the night, we'll need to move him. I'll have to run tests and find out where he came from." Walter nodded. "You think someone dumped him?" Maeve didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted to the door, then to the dog's face. If they did, it wasn't just neglect. This was deliberate. Across the ridge, half a mile from the Whitman cabin, the windows of a cabin obscured by overgrown shrubs and thick curtains glowed faintly with amber light. Inside, a man in his late 50s sat hunched over a large oak table littered with maps, binoculars, and worn notebooks. His name was Clayton Rourke, though few in Willow Creek remembered that. Now, a tall, gaunt man with sunken cheeks and a military posture he no longer wore with pride, Clayton had become something of a ghost in the town's periphery. He rarely came into the village, and when he did, it was only for supplies always paid in cash, always with a nod, but never a word. He hadn't served with distinction, though he had served long. A former handler in a military K-9 unit, he'd been quietly retired after an incident overseas that was never written into any official report. Since then, he'd lived in near isolation, haunted by orders he'd carried out and the loyalty of those who had followed him unquestioningly, especially one dog in particular. Now, through his binoculars, he stared toward the faint outline of the Whitman cabin, his jaw clenched. He had seen the boy return from the woods. He'd seen the dog in the sling, and he knew exactly which dog it was. He reached for a worn notebook and flipped to a page marked M17, terminated. But the dog wasn't dead. Not yet. The wind had shifted by morning, carrying with it the dry breath of oncoming snow. Thin veils of mist clung to the tree line, and the peaks of the mountains above Willow Creek were dipped in fresh white. In the warmth of the cabin, the world outside felt 1,000 miles away. A fire snapped softly in the hearth, casting flickers of gold across the wooden walls. Maeve sat cross-legged on the rug beside Shadow, her veterinary bag open, latex gloves already dusted with antiseptic and old blood. Shadow had made it through the night. The German Shepherd, though still too weak to rise, no longer lay motionless, his eyes sharp and liquid. Amber tracked movement in the room with weary awareness. His breath came easier now, chest rising in shallow but rhythmic waves. He flinched when Maeve applied ointment to the wound on his side, but he didn't growl. Eli, who hadn't left his side except to sleep on a blanket nearby, watched with unblinking silence. His small hands rested on his sketchbook, but today he hadn't drawn Walter brewed coffee in the corner, watching both the dog and the boy with quiet tension in his shoulders. "He's not just a mutt," Maeve muttered under her breath more to herself than anyone else. She gently tilted Shadow's head and examined the collar tag again. "I ran the code on the tag last night. K9M17. Maeve reached for her tablet from the satchel beside her. The screen glowed as she pulled up a PDF file she'd found buried in an old military veterinary database, accessible only because of her prior work with canine trauma units. "He wasn't just any working dog," she said slowly. "He was part of a disaster response division trained to locate survivors in collapsed buildings, flood zones, even war zones. Elite Level K9M17 was a code used by a now-defunct unit called Echo 6. Rumors say it was experimental. Partly military, partly private contract. They worked in places most people never hear about." Walter straightened. "What kind of places?" Chernea, Calbora, old mining zones in Canada. Mostly locations with long histories of chemical or nuclear fallout. She paused, fingers tightening around the tablet. "This dog has seen more than most soldiers." Shadow stirred slightly at the sound of Walter's boot scraping the floor. A flicker of light from the fireplace flared, and in that moment a siren wailed in the distance, a snowplow on the upper ridge making its rounds. Shadow bolted upright with a snarl, a sudden force of muscle and instinct. His teeth bared in panic. His limbs betrayed him, and he fell back hard against the floor, yelping sharply. Eli rushed to his side, not touching, just crouching nearby, his hands trembling. Unsure, Shadow's breath came fast, eyes wide and wild, scanning the room as if waiting for smoke, for flame. For the next scream, Maeve moved quickly, placing a calming hand on Shadow's chest, speaking softly. "It's okay. You're not there anymore. No more gunfire, no more collapse. You're safe." It took nearly 5 minutes for the dog to calm his body, finally curling back into the shape of a question mark. A living thing, too, used to pain. Maeve looked up at Walter. That wasn't just a reaction to a sound. That was trauma. Walter's voice was low, gravel-thick, so someone left him to die. Maeve nodded and tried to erase the evidence. Across town, just past the Willow Ridge trailhead, nestled into the mountainside like a bruise. The cabin belonging to Clayton Rourke sat in eerie stillness. The man inside had not slept. Clayton stood before a wall of corkboard lined with maps, photographs, and printed emails. Strings of red yarn connected places, dates, and faces. In the center, tacked with a dull brass pin, was a photograph of a younger Clayton dressed in a tactical uniform, one knee bent with a proud German shepherd beside him. A caption beneath read, "Eco 6, K9M17 Operation Black Hollow." He looked at it now with a kind of hollow grief. He had watched Eli carry Shadow through the woods. He hadn't meant to let the dog live, but the bullet hadn't struck deep enough. Maybe his hand had wavered. Maybe after everything he couldn't finish the betrayal. He had told himself it was mercy, but mercy wouldn't haunt him. Mercy wouldn't come back in a boy's arms. The binoculars sat on the table beside an old box marked "Confidential." Inside were files, discontinued training manuals, classified reports, photos of missions no longer acknowledged. One of them showed a rescue gone wrong in a collapsed research station in Siberia. Shadow had led a team through unstable tunnels to find 2 survivors. The rescue succeeded, but the aftermath hadn't. Shadow had returned from that mission, changed, jumpier. More reactive, no longer compliant. Anomaly, the report had called him. Clayton hadn't fought the decommission order. He'd been given a syringe and a bullet and told to make it look like an accident. Instead, he had buried the evidence, or so he thought. Now the boy had found it, and the boy would talk. Not now, maybe not even soon, but the truth had a habit of surfacing, especially when guilt and fate started digging together. Clayton's fingers hovered over an envelope. Inside was the original discharge paperwork for M17, signed with a forged name listing the dog as deceased. If Shadow ever surfaced, someone would come asking questions, and Clayton wasn't the only one who had something to lose. Back at the cabin, Maeve finished rebandaging the wounds. She had brought antibiotics and mild sedatives enough to stabilize Shadow for the next 48 hours. "I can try to get a scan scheduled," she said. "But if anyone hears I've got a dog with military tags in my clinic, questions might start knocking." Walter nodded grimly. "Then we don't bring him there." Maeve raised an eyebrow. "And if he gets worse, then you come here, we keep it quiet. Just for now." Eli, meanwhile, had picked up his pencil again. He drew without looking at the paper lines, smooth and slow. When Maeve glanced down, she saw that it wasn't Shadow this time. It was a man, tall, gaunt, watching from the trees, binoculars in hand. She frowned. "Who is that?" Eli looked up, eyes grave. He didn't answer, but he pointed toward the woods. The night sky over Willow Creek churned with heavy clouds bloated with snow, and the promise of a blizzard. The moon, pale and cold, peeked through a rift in the storm front, before vanishing behind thick veils of silver. The town, hunkered down in preparation wood piles, stacked high candles lit in windows, and radios murmuring with weather advisories. But out in the forest, far from the comfort of home, a different kind of storm was building. Eli stood at the tree line, bundled in his oversized coat boots, sinking into the soft snow. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Shadow was already ahead, his lean form cutting through the underbrush like a specter. The dog stopped every few yards to glance back, ears forward, eyes glowing, with a strange intensity that made Eli feel like he was being spoken to, even without words. Eli followed. He always did. They walked deeper into the woods, following no trail, but Shadow's instincts, through thickets of frozen fern and moss-covered stone until they reached a forgotten slope, hidden beneath a half-collapsed fence. A rusted sign, barely legible, jutted from the snowbank. Briar Hollow Mine. Closed 1978. The entrance yawned like a mouth in the earth, swallowed in darkness. Shadow hesitated only for a moment, then slipped inside. Eli paused. He didn't know how he knew what was inside, but he did. The dream had shown him. A soldier bones. A secret. He lit the flashlight clipped to his jacket and stepped inside. The mine smelled of rot and metal. Water dripped from unseen crevices echoing through the stone corridors. The beam of light danced over wooden beams, blackened by mold, old rail tracks, twisted with age, and the faint shimmer of frost clinging to everything like ghost skin. Shadow led with certainty, his gait tense. At a fork in the tunnel he stopped and pawed at the ground. There, partially buried beneath years of dirt and loose stone, was a boot. Attached to it, bones, shattered ribs, a military jacket still clinging to a skeleton. Eli dropped to his knees. His light caught something reflective on the corpse's chest, a badge. The name was scratched beyond recognition, but next to it, pinned with deliberate care, was a patch. Echo 6. Shadow let out a low whine and lowered his head. Something about his stillness told Eli this wasn't just a body. This had been someone Shadow had known. Eli's light found a second object tucked beneath the decayed uniform, a flash drive encased in a protective military-grade rubber casing. Eli picked it up and held it tight. They didn't speak as they left, but the forest seemed to hold its breath around them. Back at the cabin, Walter stood in his kitchen jaw clenched as he waited for Clayton Rourke. They had agreed to meet face-to-face under the pretense of closure. But Walter didn't believe in closure. He believed in answers. The door creaked open at 8 p.m. sharp. Clayton stepped inside, tall and gaunt as ever, wrapped in a faded green parka, his boots still dusted with snow. His eyes, once sharp as knives, now carried the weight of too many nights without peace. "I came," he said simply. Walter nodded, motioning to the chair across from him. The old wooden table between them bore 2 mugs of black coffee and a manila envelope marked in Walter's pen, Echo 6, M17. Classified. Clayton didn't sit right away. He studied Walter's face. Then the envelope. "What do you want from me?" "I want the truth," Walter said. "About that dog. About what happened to his team." Clayton's fingers twitched. He finally sat down and exhaled slowly. "You don't know what that unit was. You don't want to. I know enough. I know Eli found something in the woods. Something Shadow led him to. I know there's a dead soldier in that mine. And I know you've still got the original files." Silence. Then Clayton reached into his coat and pulled out a metal tin. Inside were laminated sheets, photographs, and a bound training log labeled M17 Behavioral Anomalies. "I never filed these," he said. "They were supposed to go through a sanitizing process, scrubbed clean. But I couldn't do it. I thought maybe one day." Walter opened the log. Inside were detailed records of Shadow's training, success rates, missions, stress responses. But near the end, the tone shifted. Field notes, personal reflections, paranoia. One entry read, "M17 no longer responds to standard commands. During the last stop, he disobeyed and returned to pull a man from rubble after evac call. I was told to put him down. I couldn't. But someone else would have." Walter looked up, jaw tight. "So you ran." Clayton didn't argue. "I buried him in the forest. I thought it was over." Walter's voice was low. "You didn't bury a dog. You buried a witness." Meanwhile, Maeve was at her clinic preparing a backup battery to power her laptop. The snowstorm had knocked out grid lines in the northern ridge, and her generator wouldn't last the night. She sat in the dim amber glow of lantern light, watching the cursor blink on her screen. Eli had returned an hour ago, his boots muddy, eyes wide. He hadn't spoken a word, just handed her the flash drive with a look that said everything. Maeve plugged it in. Files loaded encrypted but not inaccessible. She worked through the night decrypting logs, field reports, and video feeds. One file was labeled Op Sable Vale, Final Dispatch. It was footage from a helmet cam. A mission gone wrong. A tremor. A collapse, screaming. Then Shadow dragging a wounded man through smoke and flame while the others fled. And there briefly Clayton's face turning away. She stared at the screen for a long time. That night, the storm howled over Willow Creek, rattling shutters and bending trees. But deep beneath the weight of snow and silence, truths long buried had begun to claw their way into the light. The storm had calmed, leaving Willow Creek swaddled in a deceptive silence. Snow blanketed every rooftop, muffled roads, and transformed the forest into a dreamscape of white stillness. But peace was a fragile thing, and within the Whitman cabin it cracked in the quietest of ways. Eli sat bolt upright in bed. No nightmare had roused him this time, only a hollow gnawing pull in his chest, like something important had shifted, or someone he loved had cried out without a sound. Beside him, Shadow was already standing, tense and alert. His nose lifted to the air. The German shepherd's hackles rose. A growl rolled low in his throat, guttural and ancient. Eli pressed a hand to Shadow's shoulder. He didn't understand it exactly, but he felt it. Someone was near, and it wasn't good. Walter, who had been dozing in the armchair with a book on his lap, blinked awake to the sound of Shadow's growl. Years of instinct stirred in him like hot coals, kicked back to flame. He moved quickly, grabbing the revolver he kept in a drawer beneath the bookshelf. "What is it?" he asked, eyes narrowed. Eli pointed silently toward the back of the cabin. Outside, the snow glowed faintly under moonlight, but shadows moved where they shouldn't have. A shape detached from the woods and crossed the yard, slow and deliberate. Clayton Rourke moved like a phantom dark coat. Tactical boots, a thin scarf pulled over his lower face. In one hand, he carried a tranquilizer gun. In the other, a metal lead. He came for Shadow. The back door creaked. Clayton was halfway through the threshold when Shadow lunged from the shadows, snarling a flash of fangs and fury. Clayton dropped the lead and raised the tranquilizer gun, but Walter's warning shot shattered the air and the edge of the doorway above Clayton's head. He staggered back, losing his grip. "Don't move," Walter barked, stepping into view. But Clayton was prepared. He tossed something onto the ground, a stun flare. A blinding burst of white light filled the cabin, and in the seconds of confusion, Clayton lunged forward, catching Shadow by the collar and dragging him backward into the snow. Shadow thrashed, violently biting at Clayton's arm, but he had already slipped a rope muzzle into place, locking the shepherd's jaws shut. The dog went silent, teeth barred behind restraint, legs kicking in the snow. Eli screamed from the doorway, his voice cracking raw with panic. He bolted after them, boots barely tied, heart hammering. Walter shouted, calling for him to stop, but the boy was already halfway across the yard. Shadow twisted again, jerking Clayton off balance. The man cursed, dragging the dog toward the open rear hatch of a nondescript SUV parked beneath the trees. Eli reached them just as Clayton tried to hoist Shadow into the back. "No," Eli cried. Clayton turned, startled, his grip faltering, and in that split second Shadow jerked free. Just enough, with all his might, the dog knocked Clayton off his feet. They both hit the snow hard. Clayton rolled, reaching for the tranquilizer gun that had fallen nearby. His fingers brushed it. But before he could grab it, Shadow was on him. Muzzle clacking against the man's forearm, claws tearing into his jacket. Clayton screamed. Eli threw himself forward, trying to undo the muzzle, but his hand shook too much. Then headlights cut through the trees. Maeve's SUV. Walter was just behind her, his boots crunching across the ice revolver still in hand. Clayton rolled away from Shadow, scrambling toward the trees. His coat ripped his face, bleeding. "Stop right there!" Walter shouted, raising the gun, but Clayton didn't stop. He vanished into the woods. Walter hesitated, then dropped to his knees beside Shadow. The muzzle was soaked with blood. Not the dog's, but Clayton's Shadow. Whimpered once and tried to stand but collapsed. One of his front legs was bent strangely and fresh blood darkened the snow beneath his chest. "He's hurt bad," Walter said, voice tight. "Maeve, grab your kit." Eli knelt beside his dog, pressing his hands to Shadow's side. The shepherd's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment Eli felt the connection again, that silent communication that wasn't quite words, but meant everything. "You're safe now," he whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. But both of them knew this wasn't over. Morning broke over Willow Creek with a hush that felt ceremonial. The storm had passed, but the town was still blanketed in snow, thick and undisturbed as if waiting for something sacred. At the courthouse, a simple stone building with ivy clinging to its columns, reporters gathered their boots crunching in the snow. Breath fogging the cold air as they adjusted their cameras and murmured into microphones. Today was not an ordinary day. Inside, Maeve stood beside Walter, her gloved hands holding tightly onto a leather-bound case. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a low braid, revealing a tired but determined face. She wore a dark wool coat, modest but sharp, and a pin on the lapel that read, "Goals, Guardians of Loyal Service," a national organization dedicated to protecting the rights of retired working animals. Their regional representative, Helena Briggs, stood behind Maeve, a tall woman with salt and pepper hair, and the bearing of someone who once gave orders for a living. She wore a military-style trench coat and carried herself with the precision of a retired colonel. Helena had flown in the day before from Denver, appalled by the footage Maeve had decrypted and the physical condition of Shadow. She had made a few calls to former colleagues, to congressional aides, to an attorney who specialized in declassified military justice. Now she stood as a silent wall behind Maeve and Walter, radiating purpose. Walter adjusted his tie, which he hadn't worn in over a year. He glanced at Eli, sitting a few benches back, flanked by Mrs. Dillard, a gentle silver-haired widow who babysat for local families, and Dr. Harlan, the town's pediatrician who had once tried everything to coax Eli to speak again. Eli's hands clutched a small plush dog, a faded toy named Ranger. He hadn't said a word since arriving, but his eyes never left Shadow. Shadow lay beside him, a thick bandage wrapped around his shoulder, his coat carefully brushed for the occasion. The dog rested his head gently on Eli's lap. Body relaxed, but eyes alert, golden and deep. At 10:00 a.m. sharp, Judge Henry Gable entered the courtroom. He was a wiry man in his 60s with thinning gray hair, thick spectacles, and a firm but fair demeanor. He had served on the bench for 2 decades and carried the weary look of a man who had seen too much small-town crime and not enough justice. This hearing he began adjusting his glasses and glancing at the papers before him, concerns evidence submitted in regard to former Officer Clayton Rourke and the classified unit known as Echo 6, and the allegations surrounding the military. K9, now known as Shadow gasps, stirred among the few locals in attendance. Most had only heard whispers about a secret project about a boy, and his dog about a conspiracy. Maeve stood, Your Honor. I'd like to submit 2 exhibits into the record, a series of encrypted files recovered from the Briar Hollow mine, and a video extracted from a military-issue flash drive showing proof of abuse, abandonment, and cover-up surrounding Subject M17 Shadow. She handed the case to the clerk who brought it to the judge. As Judge Gable reviewed the files, Helena stepped forward. I represent Guardians of Loyal Service. We have cross-referenced this dog's ID tag and confirmed that M17 was part of an experimental recovery program terminated 4 years ago. Our records match the metadata embedded in the footage. What we're asking, Your Honor, is not only justice for what happened to this dog, but a broader investigation into Echo 6's disbandment. Judge Gable nodded slowly. I've reviewed the preliminary materials. I've also spoken to JAG representatives. If this evidence holds, there may be cause for federal inquiry. A hush settled. Walter leaned forward. Clayton Rourke tried to kill this animal twice. First in the field, and again when he came to our home. That alone demands charges. Eli shifted on the bench. His fingers tightened on Ranger. Shadow nuzzled his hand gently. Then a movement almost imperceptible. Eli stood up. He walked quiet as snowfall to the front of the courtroom. The bailiff instinctively stepped forward, unsure of what to do, but the judge raised a hand to stop him. Eli looked up at Judge Gable. His voice when it came was thin and soft, the sound of ice breaking after a long winter. He saved me. Eli said gasps again. He didn't run away. He didn't bite me. He didn't let me die. He came for me. Even when he was hurt, he turned, looking at the room, at Maeve, at Walter, at Helena, even the clerk. He's not just a dog. He's a hero. Walter wiped his eyes. Helena blinked hard and stood straighter. Judge Gable leaned back, and his voice when he spoke had changed. It was quieter now. That young man is perhaps the most powerful testimony I've ever heard. Outside the courthouse, after the hearing was adjourned, the townspeople gathered for a small ceremony arranged by the mayor's office and Gulz. A wooden podium stood beneath the flagpole dusted with snow. A plaque had been mounted beside it, in honor of Shadow K9. M17 for valor. Loyalty and service beyond the call. Eli stood beside Shadow as the ribbon was cut. A small smile played on his lips, fragile but real. Reporters asked questions. Helena gave statements. Walter shook hands with old colleagues who had come from retirement to bear witness. But it was Eli who stole every heart. When the mayor asked if he'd like to say something, the boy stepped forward, looked at the small crowd, then turned to Shadow. And he said just 3 words. "Thank you, buddy." Spring tiptoed into Willow Creek, quietly melting the last remnants of snow and coaxing crocuses out of the earth like secrets surfacing after a long silence. The town, once gripped by rumors and shadowed whispers, now breathed easier. The courthouse bell no longer rang for emergency hearings. The forest paths were open again, and children dared to wander toward the edge of the woods, not in fear, but in play. At the edge of town, the Whitman family's small farm had come to life. Rows of budding vegetable plots stretched beside a red barn with peeling paint, and chickens clucked freely near a hand-built coop. Wind chimes tinkled near the porch, dancing to a breeze laced with the scent of lavender and loam. Eli was in the garden, a wide-brimmed straw hat perched loosely on his dark curls, his jeans muddy at the knees. His laughter echoed across the field as he tried to coax a particularly stubborn goat named Crumpet back into the pen. The goat, a brown and white creature with eyes like old mischief and a deep suspicion of fences, had other ideas. Shadow herded calmly behind them, his large body moving with a purpose that was no longer military precision but something softer. Familial, Shadow had changed since the court. Ruling his gait still carried a slight limp from the night of his injury, but there was a lightness in his step now, a grace born not from obedience but from peace. His fur had grown thick and healthy golden in the spring sun. The scar near his rib cage was visible only when he lay on his side, belly up for lazy belly rubs. Most days, that's exactly where he'd be. Belly up, eyes half closed, listening to Eli's stories or Maeve's chatter. Maeve still visited often, usually after her morning rounds at the veterinary clinic. She had traded her scrubs for gardening gloves and a sun hat more than once. Today, she knelt beside Walter beneath the apple tree inspecting a sprouting herb garden. Walter looked different too. The heavy weight of vigilance had eased off his shoulders, though his back was still stiff in the mornings, and his grumbles hadn't gone anywhere. There was a renewed calm to him. He had taken to writing again sometimes with a cup of black coffee in one hand and a notebook in the other. Occasionally, Eli would peer over his shoulder to see old sketches of Shadow, alongside notes that read like memory and tribute. From the porch came a clatter. Mrs. Dillard, the town's beloved babysitter, now honorary. Grandma was setting out a tray of lemonade and cookies. She had moved in temporarily after her roof caved during the last snowstorm and never quite found a reason to leave. With her snowy hair in a messy bun, and her endless stories about raising 5 sons on nothing but beans and Bible verses, she brought a dose of chaos and joy the household hadn't known it needed. The town had embraced Shadow like one of its own. At first, some parents had been wary. Shadow's past had made headlines, and a few still whispered about military dogs and dangerous instincts. But that changed the day Shadow saved little Penny Broadhurst from tumbling down the ravine behind the school playground. The girl, only 4, had wandered too close to the edge, chasing her kite. Shadow had broken free from Eli's grip and caught her sweater just in time, dragging her back from disaster. Since then, Penny's older brother Jacob, a lanky 11-year-old with grass-stained jeans and a habit of mumbling cool under his breath, had taken to riding his bike straight to the Whitman farm after school to visit Shadow. "So, does he understand you?" Jacob had asked one afternoon watching Eli and Shadow play fetch in the orchard. Eli, no longer the silent, watchful child from months before, grinned and shrugged. Maybe, or maybe I just understand him. The connection remained quiet but steady. It wasn't magic, not really, but it was something. Sometimes Eli still dreamt in images that felt more like memories than imagination. Sometimes he could feel Shadow before seeing him, but neither of them needed explanations anymore. They had each other. That was enough. Clayton had been arrested 2 weeks after the court hearing. The FBI had taken over the case, unearthing a long trail of misconduct suppression and experimental programs that never received proper oversight. The unit Echo 6 had been buried deeper than anyone expected, but now it was unearthed and it would be watched. Clayton never returned to Willow Creek. One sunny afternoon, the town held a dedication ceremony at the community park. A statue had been commissioned, a bronze German shepherd, proud and alert, mounted atop a stone pedestal with the inscription, "To those who served, to those who were silenced, and to those who were saved." Children ran around it, tagging each other and laughing while Shadow sat quietly beneath the shade of a tree, watching with tired eyes that still missed nothing. Helena Briggs had returned for the ceremony. She wore a tailored blazer over jeans, and her handshake was still firm as iron. "You know," she told Walter afterward, "some of us are talking about creating a new program, one that honors dogs like Shadow, not just as tools but as partners and survivors." Walter nodded. "If you need a name for that initiative, I think you've already got the right one." That evening, as dusk settled like a hymn across the fields, Eli lay on the porch swing with Shadow beside him, their breathing synchronized. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and from the barn came the occasional bleat from Crumpet, still trying to stage his great escape. "I think you're gonna like it here," Eli whispered. "For good, this time." Shadow thumped his tail once, and that was the only answer needed. This story was never just about a dog or a boy. It was about the quiet, miraculous ways that God moves through broken lives, and how healing sometimes comes not through thunder or fire, but through loyalty, trust, and love that asks for nothing in return. Shadow was left to die, forgotten by the world, but not by God. Through a child's heart, a grandfather's strength, and a community's courage, we witnessed a powerful truth even when the world abandons you. God does not. He sends help in unexpected forms, sometimes with 4 paws and a silent gaze. Eli found his voice not through medicine or therapy, but through connection, faith, and the bond that God Himself designed between humans and animals. The Bible tells us that He cares for every sparrow, and through this story we see that He also cares for every wounded heart, every frightened child, and every forgotten soul. In our everyday lives, it can be easy to overlook the small miracles: the neighbor who listens, the dog who waits for you at the door, the child who smiles again after sorrow. But make no mistake, these are the fingerprints of God. His grace is not always loud, but it is always present. If this story moved your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Comment. Amen. If you believe that God's love can reach even the most broken places. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of love, redemption, and faith. And may God bless you and your loved ones with healing courage and peace. Remember, sometimes the miracle isn't the rescue, it's what comes after. Spring tiptoed into Willow Creek, quietly melting the last remnants of snow and coaxing crocuses out of the earth like secrets surfacing after a long silence. The town, once gripped by rumors and shadowed whispers, now breathed easier. The courthouse bell no longer rang for emergency hearings. The forest paths were open again, and children dared to wander toward the edge of the woods, not in fear, but in play. At the edge of a town, the Whitman family's small farm had come to life. Rows of budding vegetable plots stretched beside a red barn with peeling paint, and chickens clucked freely near a hand-built coop. Wind chimes tinkled near the porch, dancing to a breeze laced with the scent of lavender and loam. Eli was in the garden, a wide-brimmed straw hat perched loosely on his dark curls, his jeans muddy at the knees. His laughter echoed across the field as he tried to coax a particularly stubborn goat named Crumpet back into the pen. The goat, a brown and white creature with eyes like old mischief and a deep suspicion of fences, had other ideas. Shadow herded calmly behind them, his large body moving with a purpose that was no longer military precision but something softer, familial. Shadow had changed since the court ruling. His gait still carried a slight limp from the night of his injury, but there was a lightness in his step now, a grace born not from obedience but from peace. His fur had grown thick and healthy, golden in the spring sun. The scar near his rib cage was visible only when he lay on his side belly up for lazy belly rubs. Most days, that's exactly where he'd be, belly up, eyes half closed, listening to Eli's stories or Maeve's chatter. Maeve still visited often, usually after her morning rounds at the veterinary clinic. She had traded her scrubs for gardening gloves and a sun hat more than once. Today, she knelt beside Walter beneath the apple tree inspecting a sprouting herb garden. Walter looked different, too. The heavy weight of vigilance had eased off his shoulders, though his back was still stiff in the mornings, and his grumbles hadn't gone anywhere. There was a renewed calm to him. He had taken to writing again sometimes with a cup of black coffee in one hand and a notebook in the other. Occasionally, Eli would peer over his shoulder to see old sketches of Shadow, alongside notes that read like memory and tribute. From the porch came a clatter. Mrs. Dillard, the town's beloved babysitter, now honorary. Grandma was setting out a tray of lemonade and cookies. She had moved in temporarily after her roof caved during the last snowstorm and never quite found a reason to leave. With her snowy hair in a messy bun and her endless stories about raising 5 sons, on nothing but beans and Bible verses, she brought a dose of chaos and joy the household hadn't known it needed. The town had embraced Shadow like one of its own. At first, some parents had been wary. Shadow's past had made headlines, and a few still whispered about military dogs and dangerous instincts. But that changed the day Shadow saved little Penny Broadhurst from tumbling down the ravine behind the school playground. The girl, only 4, had wandered too close to the edge, chasing her kite. Shadow had broken free from Eli's grip and caught her sweater just in time, dragging her back from disaster. Since then, Penny's older brother Jacob, a lanky 11-year-old with grass-stained jeans and a habit of mumbling cool under his breath, had taken to riding his bike straight to the Whitman farm after school to visit Shadow. "So, does he understand you?" Jacob had asked one afternoon watching Eli and Shadow play fetch in the orchard. Eli, no longer the silent, watchful child from months before, grinned and shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe, I just understand him." The connection remained quiet but steady. It wasn't magic, not really, but it was something. Sometimes Eli still dreamt in images that felt more like memories than imagination. Sometimes he could feel Shadow before seeing him, but neither of them needed explanations anymore. They had each other. That was enough. Clayton had been arrested 2 weeks after the court hearing. The FBI had taken over the case, unearthing a long trail of misconduct suppression and experimental programs that never received proper oversight. The unit Echo 6 had been buried deeper than anyone expected, but now it was unearthed, and it would be watched. Clayton never returned to Willow Creek. One sunny afternoon, the town held a dedication ceremony at the community park. A statue had been commissioned, a bronze German shepherd, proud and alert, mounted atop a stone pedestal with the inscription, "To those who served, to those who were silenced, and to those who were saved." Children ran around it, tagging each other and laughing, whilst Shadow sat quietly beneath the shade of a tree, watching with tired eyes that still missed nothing. Helena Briggs had returned for the ceremony. She wore a tailored blazer over jeans, and her handshake was still firm as iron. "You know," she told Walter afterward, "some of us are talking about creating a new program, one that honors dogs like Shadow, not just as tools but as partners and survivors." Walter nodded. "If you need a name for that initiative, I think you've already got the right one." That evening, as dusk settled like a hymn across the fields, Eli lay on the porch swing with Shadow beside him, their breathing synchronized. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and from the barn came the occasional bleat from Crumpet still trying to stage his great escape. "I think you're gonna like it here," Eli whispered. "For good this time." Shadow thumped his tail once, and that was the only answer needed. This story was never just about a dog or a boy. It was about the quiet, miraculous ways that God moves through broken lives, and how healing sometimes comes not through thunder or fire, but through loyalty, trust, and love that asks for nothing in return. Shadow was left to die forgotten by the world, but not by God, through a child's heart, a grandfather's strength, and a community's courage. We witnessed a powerful truth. Even when the world abandons you, God does not. He sends help in unexpected forms, sometimes with 4 paws and a silent gaze. Eli found his voice not through medicine or therapy, but through connection, faith, and the bond that God Himself designed between humans and animals. The Bible tells us that He cares for every sparrow, and through this story we see that He also cares for every wounded heart, every frightened child, and every forgotten soul. In our everyday lives, it can be easy to overlook the small miracles: the neighbor who listens, the dog who waits for you at the door, the child who smiles again after sorrow. But make no mistake, these are the fingerprints of God. His grace is not always loud, but it is always present. If this story moved your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Comment: Amen, if you believe that God's love can reach even the most broken places. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of love, redemption, and faith. And may God bless you and your loved ones with healing courage and peace. Remember, sometimes the miracle isn't the rescue, it's what comes after.